Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are thrilled to see this big and diverse group joining us to discuss HVAC choices for student health and learning. And thank you all for spending this hour with us. It is definitely going to be jam-packed. Before we jump into the webinar, I wanted to start with a couple of announcements for you. First, please be aware that the audience will stay muted throughout the webinar to avoid any mishaps. But that being said, we would love to hear from you during the webinar. Please type any questions that you might have into the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can leave questions for us at any point during the webinar, and we'll hold them to answer until the end. And then lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording by email when it is ready. Next slide. So my name is Emma Hines, and I'll be one of your moderators today. I am speaking to you on behalf of RMI, formerly Rocky Mountain Institute. We are a nonprofit organization working to accelerate the clean energy transition. And I work on a really unique team here focused on the health benefits of transitioning away from fossil fuels in our buildings. And I'll pass to my partner, Sarah Ross, for a quick introduction now too.
Great, thanks, Emma. My name is Sarah Ross. I'm a co-founder at Undaunted K-12. Undaunted is a national nonprofit with a mission to support America's K-12 public schools to make an equitable transition to zero carbon emissions while also preparing young people to build sustainable futures in rapidly changing climate. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks, Sarah. And we are also very lucky to be joined by 3 speakers today. Each will introduce themselves in a little bit more detail, but as a quick overview for you all, our speakers today are Dr. Erica Etland from Perkins & Will, Wyatt Ross from CMTA, and Julia Casagrande from the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. Next slide. So before I pass to each of our speakers who are going to present on pretty distinct subject matter, part of my role here today is to provide some introductory remarks and a little bit of context to help construct a cohesive narrative between the 3. So to make sure that we're all on the same page and have a basic understanding, when we talk about HVAC systems or HVAC, we're talking about the heating, cooling, and ventilation equipment that's used to keep the air in our buildings a comfortable temperature and humidity and clean from any pollution or viruses. And there are 3 big motivators behind this webinar, and these have also underpinned Sarah and I's work on this for the past year and brought us together in the first place. So to walk through those, the first motivator is increased attention. So you probably all know that we are now officially 3 years out from the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And if there's one thing that has been reinforced yet again, it's this critical role that HVAC equipment plays in schools for disease mitigation and how school leaders can select the best equipment for that and beyond. The next motivator is increased need. So COVID is obviously still a great example of this, but to pull another one, we've also been seeing the impacts of school closures and lost learning time from extreme heat, especially in schools lacking cooling. And this is going to continue to be a problem here in the US, demonstrating a really clear need for all schools to have adequate cooling in place. And then finally, the third motivator for us being here today is increased funding. So we're recognizing that we're in this moment where that increased attention and increased need are being met with a new funding landscape with more than one source of funds like the Inflation Reduction Act and ESSER funds as well. And this is allowing states and jurisdictions and school districts to invest in their HVAC systems, making it important that we get those investments right. Next slide. So over the past year, Sarah and I have worked to solidify our thinking on this topic and to also make something of our desire to educate and advocate for cleaner and healthier schools. So we did what most folks do, and we wrote a report, and it was published back in January. So we're using this webinar to uplift its messages again, but also the voices of our 3 expert guests today. There's one more nugget from this report, though, that carries over into the naming and framing of our webinar here today, which is the title of having choices when it comes to our HVAC systems in schools. So we set up a framework in the report of legacy and modern HVAC equipment. And it's important that we communicate with you all here the distinctions between these two, because you're going to hear us and our speakers talk about the importance of transitioning from that legacy to modern equipment. Next slide. So let's start with legacy HVAC equipment. These systems rely on burning fossil fuels. That can be things like gas, oil, or propane, and they're burned on site in our school buildings to make heat, which is a relatively inefficient process. Some common examples in the school environment are systems like boilers and central packaged units. They may or may not be supplemented with air conditioning, and many don't accommodate advanced ventilation and filtration. It's also really important to note that when we say legacy, that we're not necessarily talking about the age of the equipment, but more so about the approach to making heat. So a brand new gas boiler is still in this legacy camp because it uses this outdated and inefficient approach to keeping buildings comfortable. Next slide. On the other hand, though, modern systems, instead of making heat, they move heat that already exists in the air or in the ground. And by using this approach of moving heat, we can both heat and cool our indoor spaces with just one really cool piece of equipment, and that's called a heat pump. This approach doesn't involve combustion of fossil fuels. It can be powered with clean, renewable energy, and it's vastly more efficient than burning fossil fuels, and it does a better job of ventilation and filtration. This transition to modern equipment is already happening in leading schools today, which you'll hear about in a little bit, and it really is the future for all schools. Next slide. So I'll wrap up this background by sharing that there are 3 key messages that we want to deliver in today's webinar, and each of our guests will speak on a portion of these messages. So the first big one is that transitioning to modern HVAC systems is critical to student health and learning. Our second message is that over the past few years, and especially now with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, that the economics are changing in favor of all electric and high performance HVAC options. And then third, which is really exciting, is that we already have fantastic examples of how states and jurisdictions and school districts are taking action on this transition. So now, with all of that background in mind, it is my pleasure to hand the mic over to our first speaker, Dr. Erica Etland, who is a true expert in connecting building quality to student health and performance. And she is going to dive deeper into this first key message for us. So take it away from here, Erica.
Awesome. Thank you, Emma. Hi, everybody. I get to be sort of today's hype woman, I think, which is, so my name is Dr. Erica Etland, and I'm the director of the Human Experience Lab here at Perkins & Will. And much of my research is focused on how K-12 buildings impact child health and really what do we do about it. So to kick us off today, I'm going to go into 2 critical questions. First, the why now and why HVAC. So we're going to get into it. So the first piece here is that this is not new. And this discussion of ventilation in K-12 is not really something we have ever left in our sort of discussion. You know, it dates back to reducing tuberculosis infections in the early 20th century. And yet, what's interesting to me when I look at these images from almost 100 years ago, we weren't able to radically change the way that we responded to this last pandemic. We had outdoor classrooms, we opened windows. And so on the next slide, it highlights the fact that this is, you know, our buildings need to be thinking about this radically, and that as we modernize our K-12 buildings, that this isn't just sort of improving air quality for a pandemic, it's even looking right before. So if we think about 2019, we had a measles outbreak that spread through coughing and sneezing. This impacted 22 states at the highest level since 1992. Then we see that this is an equity issue. And so we're also recognizing that there's just persistent inequities when we think about asthma, which is one of the largest determinants of chronic absenteeism. And then we just have seasonal issues like, seasonal flu that is impacting 18 states also in 2019. So as I go through this and I think about, well, why now? On the next slide, it's really about getting into the data. And so we have growing evidence that our K-12 facilities are in need of replacement or repairs. And, if we look at this 2020 congressional report, what we see is that 54% of public school districts needed to update or replace multiple building systems, but 41% of school districts needed significant HVAC system updates. And so this is equivalent to 36,000 schools nationwide. So this is a really important time for us to think about, well, what is this evidence and what do we do about it? So next, let's get into the sort of why now from a human side. We all fall into the trap of maybe prioritizing the building, but it really comes down to people. And so when we think about improving our students' environmental quality, it's going to have a lasting impact on their growth and development. So every decision we make now actually helps when we think about the fact that by the time our students graduate 12th grade, they've spent 15,000 hours in their school building, their lungs have continued to develop and sort of function in a certain way. We know that kids are breathing 50% more air. And so all of these aspects are leading to sort of an increased susceptibility that we need to be thinking about. This isn't just an office building. This is really something where the people who occupy this space make this an important priority. And so on the next slide, we talked about, well, what is that growing evidence and research? Well, back in 2017, with the Healthy Buildings team at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, we started to dive into what were the 9 foundations of a healthy building. And what we found was ventilation, air quality, thermal health, dust pests, all are having radical impacts on our child and teacher health. And so this was sort of an early framework for us to think about. And I would say through the pandemic, we've had the ability to maybe expand it to other social and emotional, holistic health perspectives. But for today, I want us to just get into this. So on next slide, we see that we have this incredible report that kind of does all the synthesis for you. So if you're enthusiastic about acoustics, by all means, knock yourself out. But we found out that what was really important is that there's this incredible body of research that goes beyond even our RMI report, but allows us to really understand what happens if we don't make these health-based decisions. So basically, on the next slide, what we see is that there was a central thesis of this document, which was that health is actually foundational to student thinking and performance. So for every day that a child is in a classroom that's too hot, too stuffy, there's direct impacts on their ability to focus, to be attentive. And so at the end of an academic year, what are you really measuring? Are you measuring sort of their actual ability, or is it sort of being influenced by the student's environmental conditions that are impacting those test scores? So this is sort of why this is relevant, but I want us to get into why HVAC specifically. So if we get into this, what we see is that there's actually lots of sources of these indoor air quality pollutants, and it's everything from the furniture and what chemicals are in our products. So if we think real micro, thinking about viral particles like, seasonal flu or COVID, we also bring in other, common pollutants. This can be things like our adhesives, our supplies, and then it gets into stuff that is driven by our building. So it could be our school occupants, so the building as itself. So thinking about on-site combustion, when we think about some of that legacy HVAC aspect to it, we also see that some of our past building materials have migrated into the dust, creating this legacy pollutant situation that we need to be thinking about. We have seasonal pollutants, things like allergens, pollen, even just wildfires that we know can track across the United States. And then even the siting of the building. Is it located close to traffic, major airports, other sort of waste sites as well? So these are just important factors for us to be considering of, okay, there's the soup around us and how are we going to respond? And that's on our next slide, is really thinking about ventilation and filtration as a true spectrum. So there's 3 main goals of ventilation. One is to just control and remove some of those airborne pollutants. The second is to dilute indoor air with fresh or clean air. And that's the assumption that the outdoor air is cleaner than our indoor air. And then the third is managing temperature and humidity. So these are opportunities for us to think that it's not, well, do you have ventilation? There's lots of, nuance in that conversation that we'll get into today. But again, focused on health, if I think about the next slide, what we see here is that, again, that foundational piece. We know that when we underventilate our classrooms, we have increases in viral infections, increase of wheeze, sick building syndrome symptoms, even just satisfaction decreases. And with that comes, decrements in attention, comprehension, concentration. So no wonder then we see that there's impacts on our standardized tests. And I love the study on the next slide, which is just basically saying that, you know, a poorly ventilated classroom is equivalent to a student skipping breakfast. And yet we have universal breakfast, you know, programs across the US to fill that need because we know it's important. And so to me, some of this work really gets down to an equity piece. So if I look at the next slide, what we see is that African American and Hispanic students, as well as free and reduced lunch students, are experiencing high levels of indoor temperature. So this isn't just about sort of the pollutant side, it's also about the temperature that they're taking their tests. And so what we find is that they're compared to their white Caucasian counterparts or their more affluent counterparts who are typically in that optimal temperature for test performance, we see that there's this discrepancy. So when we talk about HVAC, it's really also an equity piece. And so to kind of nerd out a little bit more on thermal comfort, on the next slide, one thing I would like us to sort of start thinking about, and this was really critical in the Healthy Buildings work at Harvard with Joe Allen, was really shifting our conversation around thermal comfort, which is really just a subjective measure of, you know, how hot are you in this space? You know, are you comfortable in this environment? And really acknowledging that children have higher baseline metabolic rates, they have higher core body temperatures, their ability to acclimatize is not the same. And so when we even think about, you know, how some of these standards were created, like ASHRAE 55, we find that, you know, they're not maybe meeting the needs of a very sort of active third grade class, perhaps, and that they were based on sort of men in three-piece suits. So we have to sort of shift our thinking to something around thermal health. And so this is an assessment that's bringing in some of those personal factors, clothing and metabolic rate and physical activity. So on the next slide, we're jumping into the fact that, you know, we see that there's this U-shaped relationship, that there's also cold stress as well as heat stress. And so being able to provide both heating and cooling in our buildings is critical, because when we see that we kind of go to those either extremes, there's impacts on, you know, our memory, our reasoning, and our skills that make us sort of more susceptible, and especially young students. And to me, on the next slide is really when we think about it in the context of climate, that there's this important piece here, which is that in a study of 75,000 students, they found that students taking an exam on a 90-degree day versus a 75-degree day were 12% more likely to fail that exam. And so this is equivalent to the Black-White achievement gap. So we have a real important focus here, where if we think about the average life of a school building, how many 90-degree days are in our future? And so with that, I want us to kind of get into the action. And so that is it for me. So thanks so much. On the next slide is just my contact info and some other resources. And we get into indoor air quality a lot more in depth on a podcast called Inhabit, which is a Perkins and Will production. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Erica, for giving us an all too quick dip into this really deep body of research that connects the built environment with our human health. So now we're going to hear from Wyatt Ross. Wyatt is an energy and sustainability engineer with CMTA. CMTA is recognized as a national leader for delivering high-performance sustainable projects. Their portfolio includes the first net zero school in the country, Richardsville Elementary in Kentucky over a decade ago. It also includes more recently the first, as far as I know, net zero school retrofit, Buckley Elementary in Connecticut. And it includes the first building to combine WELL certification and net zero, which happens to be CMT's very own headquarters in Louisville. So Wyatt, thank you so much for being with us here today in Brian's stead. Where should we start?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So happy to be here. Good afternoon, everybody. So in addition, to talking about the health benefits and performance ramifications of our HVAC systems, we also want to talk about the environmental impacts that our HVAC systems can have in our schools. And so today I want to talk a little bit about what these modern systems look like in juxtaposition to kind of this legacy equipment that we're talking about, and what that means from an emission standpoint from our buildings, and then also what are some tools and some recent legislation that we can leverage to help achieve and implement and deploy these systems. So if you jump to the next slide. So with these modern systems, kind of a core concept that we're looking at here is the concept of electrification. And so when we're talking about electrification, what that means is it's the switching of utilizing combustion on site in our buildings to generate heat as it relates to HVAC, and switching to systems or technologies that are fully electric. And the reasoning behind this is that when we switch our buildings to utilizing systems that are electric, eventually we can depend on renewable energy such as solar, nuclear, wind, hydro, to generate that electricity. And the benefit that has, not only at the building level, but at the global level, is that that transition will allow us to use less greenhouse gas intensive fuel sources that you see here on this slide. And it also will decrease the amount of air pollution that we're seeing both at the building level and our local community level, and also at the global scale. So if you jump to the next slide. For the most part, when we're talking about the fuel sources that we're utilizing for generating heat in our buildings, whether it be boilers or packaged rooftop equipment, we're typically talking about natural gas. And so what you can see in that purple bar there is when we combust this gas, it has a significant greenhouse gas impact, which contributes to climate change. And then in addition to combusting that natural gas, there's also what we call fugitive emissions, which are associated with the leakage of natural gas as it's distributed to your building. And so if we can remove these systems or the use of these fuels from our buildings, we can make a tremendous impact on reducing our overall carbon impact. Next slide. So we talked a little bit about legacy versus modern equipment. There's kind of 2 points that I want to make. And so when we're talking about legacy equipment, to Emma's point, these aren't necessarily old pieces of equipment in our buildings. It's more so that it's technology that is more traditional. It's been around, and it's not going to meet the needs of our schools in the future. And so we're talking about, hot water boilers, steam boilers, things that can't achieve the efficiency levels of some of the modern equipment that we're talking about. But it also could be electric heat, which is, resistant heat, similar to getting hot when you touch a light bulb, only going to achieve an efficiency of around 99%. The other downside of these legacy equipment, pieces of equipment, is that they can only generate heat, and we're coming into a world which will more and more so require cooling. And so this modern equipment, which we can more broadly classify as heat pump technology, has a couple of benefits. One, it's extremely more efficient, as you can see, 200 to 700% efficient, because it relies on moving heat rather than generating heat. And then the second benefit is that they can also simultaneously provide cooling. So they're more of a dual purpose technology. Next slide. And so when we look at comparing these technologies from an operational emission standpoint, because you're probably wondering, just because I electrify, where is that electricity coming from? There's still emissions associated with it. So what this is looking at is if we take a sample school in a region that has currently a fairly dirty grid, somewhere where that's using mostly coal-fired power plants to generate electricity, and we look at switching between a natural gas boiler that's generating heat at the building versus an electric heat pump, what are the total emissions of those two systems, including the emissions from electricity? And so what we see is over time, over a 30-year period, as we expect our grid to deploy more and more renewable energy and become cleaner over time, by the end of those two systems' life, a school that deployed electric heat pumps can expect to reduce emissions by almost 80% compared to a school that chose to use a natural gas boiler starting today. And so this just kind of gives you the sense of scale of the greenhouse gas emissions of an electrified new technology HVAC system can save. Next slide. So all that said, you still have to pay for these systems. And so how do we do that? And so, I think it's really important to be aware of the recent legislation that has passed. I'm sure most people have heard about the Inflation Reduction Act at this point. There's kind of two big things that I want you to take away from the slide, and then you can use the rest as a text as a reference. But the big thing is that before, in the recent past, these tax credits have been available in some form or another, or they have existed, but they have not been available to public K-12 schools. And so that has changed with this legislation. And so now there are incentives available that can help cover the cost or any premium associated with these modern technology. And then the other big change is that for some of these technologies, the tax credit base has increased from 10% in the case of geothermal heat pumps up to 30%. And there's additional incentives that can potentially raise that. And so what that means is that not only can these heat pumps to modern technologies meet a lot of the technical needs of heating and cooling, but they can also meet some of the financial needs that districts are facing. Next slide. So again, we won't go into all of the technologies that are covered by this bill, but really the big one for our conversation today is ground source heat pumps. Also solar photovoltaics are covered, battery storage, some microgrid technology. and a whole slew of other technologies that we won't have time to get into. Next slide. And so just real quickly, I wanted to jump into, kind of a case study. This is a school that Sarah mentioned that we worked on in Connecticut, net zero energy renovation. It did not leverage the tax credits, but this is kind of a case study to prove out what it would have looked like if they had, how beneficial that could have been. And so this is a life cycle study over life cycle cost analysis over 25 years. And you can see if we just compared to a code minimum system that we could have deployed, it would have cost roughly $13 million over the course of that system's life to own and operate. And so if we compare that to the geothermal system that they went with on the next slide, you can see that we were able to provide them with a system that had almost a $3 million savings over the course of the system's life. The only downside is that it did have a small premium associated with going with that HVAC solution, and that was going to result in a 6-year payback. So if we jump to what these new tax credits could have done for the financial story of the system, is that it would have resulted in a 34% tax credit that could have covered 34% of the total cost of the entire HVAC line item associated with the system, and reduced the 6-year payback to 1 year, so almost an immediate return on investment, and saved $5 million over the course of the system's life for that district. And so the key takeaway here is that with these tax credits, one, before the tax credit, this HVAC system still made a lot of sense and had a lot of merit for all the health reasons that Emma was talking about, or sorry, Erica was talking about, as well as the energy savings associated with the system. But with the tax credits, it almost becomes this no-brainer, first cost, best option, and then all of those ancillary benefits as well. And so this just shows the magnitude of impact these credits could have for looking at these options. Next slide. So quick, sustainability playbook here. How do we actually go about achieving and implementing these systems? And so when you have a project come online where you're looking to maybe do an HVAC retrofit or new construction or whatever it may be, kind of step one is that we really need to make sure that we're asking for the right qualified people that can design and deliver these systems. And so including language in our RFPs that talk about performance outcomes, whether it be the health and wellness outcomes, the energy savings, the system types. If you're asking the right questions in the RFP, you'll bring people to the table that can deliver those solutions. The second thing is during design, design of any school can be messy. And so you have to have advocates both on the design team side with the architect, the engineers, structural contractors, and on the school district side that can continue to ask the right questions, make sure that we're talking about the right things and that we're focused on achieving those objectives that we talked about today. The third thing, and this one's really important, as we transition to more and more modern systems and away from traditional systems where contractors and estimators are more familiar, that transition can be a little bit of a pain period. And so estimators, if they aren't super familiar with these new systems, you might see them put in some buffer or safety factors associated with the cost of these new systems. And that can kind of inherently price out these systems, maybe unintentionally. And so what we want to do is make sure that we're getting early pricing sets that are very detailed, kind of dig into the weeds and make sure that we're getting the right information so that we're not making any assumptions that might be wrong and falsely price out systems that we would like to keep. So the last step is then managing costs. And so I said it before, Buckley was able to achieve the geothermal HVAC system with a dedicated ventilation system and all these additional benefits before these ITC tax credits through the Inflation Reduction Act. So there are ways to keep projects within budget as long as you're prioritizing the right things. So if we're aware of what the goals and the systems that we can deploy, we can prioritize those in and almost always make it work. And then on top of that, we now have these new financial resources and incentives that can kind of be icing on top to make these more feasible. And that's it for me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Wyatt. So now that we've heard from Erica about the importance of HVAC systems in schools and Wyatt about electrification and how the Inflation Reduction Act is reimagining the funding landscape for all electric retrofits, I am really pleased to pass the mic to Julia Casagrande, who will be giving us a behind the scenes look at New York City's recent and powerful commitment to electrifying schools. So take it away from here, Julia.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Emma. And it was great to have all of that information from Erica and Wyatt. I'm excited to dive into how New York City is working to electrify our schools and how we're navigating the different laws and priorities that we have in this space. So about me, my name is Julia Casagrande. I'm a policy advisor at the mayor's office. I work on researching and developing policy for New York City in the building decarbonization space and in the climate retrofit space. We've worked on developing policy like Local Law 154, our all electric new buildings law, and our clean construction executive order. But I also work on coordinating and advising city agencies that are doing decarbonization work, particularly when there are multiple agencies involved. And that's what I'm going to get into today on the school electrification front. So next slide. I was just going to give a little background on the New York City school system. We have over 1,400 school buildings in the city, and that's the largest school district in the country, and then also the largest contributor to municipal energy use within the city. So this chart on the right shows that K-12 schools are 32% of our municipal energy use, and it's also our largest source of municipal greenhouse gas emissions. I would note these buildings are old. We're talking about legacy systems that may or may not be new. In this case, they are largely very old boilers. We have old electrical systems. We have old envelopes. We have a lot of historic buildings that are 100 years old, and they are registered historic sites. So it's complicated to retrofit these buildings. That being said, our school construction authority and our Department of Education have been doing a lot to reduce the emissions of our buildings. As of 2007, we have all our new buildings following Green Schools Guide, which is the New York City Schools specific version of LEED compliance. And we have about 10 to 15 new schools that are built each year and have been following this since 2007. Obviously, it's been updated a lot of times since then. We also have a lot of efficiency work that's been going on. So across the portfolio, the municipal portfolio, the city has reduced emissions by 26%. And then there's a lot of innovative work with green roofs. We have a net zero school in Staten Island, PS62R, increasing amounts of solar, et cetera. But there's still a lot of work to do in this space. A lot of the improvements to date have been from like fuel switching and the electrical grid cleaning up, and there's a lot of work to do. So what I was going to highlight is we have 200 schools remaining, about 200 schools remaining that are burning number 4 heating oil and emit very relatively high amounts of air pollution. So that's sort of the universe that we're focusing on for this electrification initiative, and I'll go into that more on the next slide. So in the landscape, there's also some competing laws and priorities that are relevant to the policy decisions that we came up with. Fuel oil 4, I don't know, depending on where folks live, may or may not use this fuel, but it's a heavy residual fuel oil and it emits high amounts of air pollution. The phase out of fuel oil 4 was required by 2030. When we set this policy, we actually just last month passed a law that's accelerating this phase out, and now it's going to be required by 2025 for schools and 2027 for the private sector. We also have biofuel heating requirements, which are state mandates. There's city mandates, but then the state mandates are more stringent than city. So that's what we're following. We're going to be having to use 10% biodiesel by 2025 and 20% by 2030 in all of our heating oil. We also have Local Law 97, which is our building performance law, and there's requirements for private buildings, which gets more press, but we also have municipal operations requirements that are actually more stringent. We have to reduce our municipal portfolio emissions by 40% by 2025 and 50% by 2030, and that's from 2006 levels. The last law I would note is Local Law 154, which is our all electric new buildings law. We have all schools will be electric by law as of January 5th, 2025, but they're already building all electric schools at this point. I would just also note that there's all these laws that we have to comply with, and then there's also our priority, which is to make sure that we're focusing on improving air quality and delivering benefits to New Yorkers, particularly in neighborhoods with high asthma and those that have borne the brunt of environmental injustice in the past. So on the right here is a slide that shows the discrepancy of asthma emergency department visits from air pollution in New York City. So we have Northern Manhattan and the Bronx really, and then some in central Brooklyn really feeling the brunt of that. Next slide. Thank you. So with all of that in mind, we needed a plan to get our schools off of fuel oil number 4 and also to leapfrog to electrification to meet our decarbonization requirements. So we did not want to do any more replacement in kind, putting in new natural gas boilers that would replace fuel oil boilers. We definitely wanted to focus on electrification. However, we have 1,400 schools, so we couldn't electrify them all right away. So in the fall, Mayor Adams announced the Leading the Charge initiative, which is a $4 billion commitment to electrifying existing school buildings. And we have 100 schools that are be electrifying by 2030. You may remember from the earlier slide that we have 200 schools that are burning number 4 fuel oil. So what we decided to do was no new boilers. We are retrofitting the existing boilers to comply with the short-term regulations for to phase out number 4 fuel oil and have the biodiesel contents, and using our capital, our big dollars to install heat pumps. So we're doing an operation and maintenance retrofit on the existing boilers, get the quick air quality benefits at a much lower cost, and we're focusing the big dollars on our school electrification project. Also note that we're starting in communities. We prioritize communities with high asthma rates, as well as a heat vulnerability index and high truck traffic, which just adds more pollution to the area. Next slide. So I just wanted to speak a little about the collaborative strategy that we used to get to this agreement. Within the government, we have our Office of Management and Budget, who committed to not funding new boilers. So they really decided where the money was going to be going, and that's how we got the commitment for the electrification. Our School Construction Authority and Department of Education worked super closely together to figure out the technicality of these conversions. As I said, our buildings are really old. It's difficult to retrofit them. So these teams worked really closely together on the technical aspects. Our Department of Citywide Administrative Services oversees our portfolio of energy use for the city at large. So we worked with them, and then our office more on the policy and advising. We also we've had a lot of support for this initiative. Environmental justice groups, labor unions, and community groups have been advocating for school electrification way before this announcement was made. There was a Creating Green Healthy Schools initiative that was directed specifically at the mayor's office to implement changes such as this. Of course, there's more to do, and they continue to helpfully push us to go further. But largely, we've gotten a lot of support in this area. And I just put some screenshots of tweets there. On expected outcomes, we saw a huge air quality improvement from when we phased out number 6 heating oil, which was the prior phase out. This was completed by 2016. From that phase out, we see an annual reduction of 1,200 tons PM2.5 in the air around New York, and that prevents 210 approximately premature deaths annually. We expect this trend to be continued with the accelerated phase out of fuel oil number 4. And in prioritizing environmental justice areas for electrification, we want to make sure that these areas have the additional benefit. And we will see a reduction in air pollution and improved health and keep New York City on the path to meet our climate mandates through leapfrogging to electrification. Just note, like, the city has a lot of power in where we spend our money, and we see this as a $4 billion market signal over 8 years towards electrification and decarbonization. So we're hoping this will help spur the market in New York City to have more contractors on board to do the work. And that's all I've got.
That was awesome. That was awesome. Thank you so much, Julie. The work that you all Our Doing New York City is really nation leading, and we're so thrilled that you could share it with the audience today. We hope these panelists have inspired you all to think about what is possible in your own communities. After all, there is so much to be gained. You can read more about the 6 benefits of moving to all electric high performance systems in the paper. Our speakers touched on almost all of the benefits here today. And so right now, I'm going to assume that you're with us and that you are compelled and that you are ready to move to action. So let's go to the next slide. The report has a recommendation section at the end that is organized by role. So are you a state policymaker? Are you a school board member? Are you a parent? We've offered our thoughts on how you can champion the work from wherever you sit in the world. So please take a look at those recommendations. So I'm actually going to focus now on the potent moments for intervention that we cannot afford to miss. The first is new construction. New construction is one of those rare opportunities when we hold the responsibility of making good 50-year choices. So we really need to ensure that all new construction incorporates this modern HVAC technology. This can be a challenge, right? As Wyatt mentioned, there are contractors and some design partners that are frankly more comfortable with how they've been doing things, this legacy equipment, and change is hard. So if your community is building a new school, make sure your town leaders are clear on the importance and benefits of embracing these modern systems right from the start of the process. And make sure your design partners are also on board, or it will be very difficult to move in this direction. The second potent moment that we need to have our eyes peeled for is systems replacement. HVAC systems reach the end of their useful life and need to be replaced. The key here is to avoid what we call a like-for-like replacement. And instead, we need to make a break for this modern equipment. And again, here it's about establishing modern HVAC systems as the goal early on. We can't wait until systems fail to have the conversation. At that point, it's an emergency and we're destined for a like-for-like replacement. And the last opportunity is really about facilities planning. Our facilities plans that actually too few of our schools have need to reflect this desired transition from legacy systems to modern systems. These plans are sometimes called decarbonization plans when they absorb this lens. And our partners at New Buildings Institute have a great tool for that work that we will put into the chat for you all. Next slide. So with those 3 points of intervention in mind, we've all got work to do. And we've got 2 easy to digest one-pagers that you can use to open the conversation with leaders in your town. One is on the big ideas, right? A non-technical set of guideposts for really building understanding and therefore confidence in this area. And the second is a one-pager that recaps these 6 benefits of modern systems. So please use these as conversation openers. They are available on our website that we'll put again in the chat, so it's handy for you here. Next slide. And lastly, before we get to Q&A, I really want to recognize all of our wonderful supporting organizations. We have a stellar audience here today, largely because they helped us get the word out. And we are particularly appreciative of the organizations who contributed staff time, our advisors. We had a wonderful set of advisors on this paper, our leading contributors in the field. And we are so grateful that they devoted time to improving our thinking and our writing on this topic. So a big shout out to ASHRAE, the Center for Green Schools, the Collaborative for High Performance Schools, CMTA, New Buildings Institute, Perkins and Will, and Stanford. So thank you so much. So it's time for your questions, and I'm going to exercise my moderator role here and ask the first one. So for each of our panelists, in 30 seconds, this is your short little sound bite. Tell us what is the most important thing that you want the audience to take away from your presentation. We're going to go in order. So Dr. Etland, Erica, you are up first.
Awesome. So, I think one thing that became really evident from the chat is that we HVAC is a part of this, but it is not the whole solution. And I think we have to really be thinking about, especially when we're talking about equity, that we take sort of this look at the hierarchy of controls and where is HVAC a part of the solution, but recognizing that all buildings are not going to be able to kind of get to the Ferrari of HVAC systems, that we need to be able to sort of think about where does behavior change come in terms of energy conservation, where does it come in terms of reducing, asthma triggers. So I do think there's, just something that I feel very strongly about that's coming through the chat is that it's not just about outdoor air pollution, it's about the indoor. And I think that's where sort of the human behavior side complements some of these HVAC decisions. And then real quick, coming from an architecture firm, I think it's really important that you see yourselves as advocates to hold them accountable, to make sure that they're giving you the life cycle costs, that they're really trying to sort of work dynamically with people like CMTA and having the correct engineers on the job to make sure that they're providing sort of the full energy savings. Because I know there's some back and forth that health is, wow, we're talking about health first and not about energy, but I do think it's so often forgotten about what we're really trying to get to. And it is so foundational to sort of the main purpose of a school. So let's think holistically about all of this.
Great. Wyatt, that was Erica's 30 seconds, maybe. What's your 30 seconds?
Great. Yeah. So I guess two things. One, I think it's really important to take away from this conversation just how important HVAC systems are on the impacts of health, wellness, thermal comfort, thermal health, emissions, energy cost savings. I think a lot of times HVAC can kind of be an afterthought when it comes to designing our schools. And so hopefully a takeaway is that, there's actually really important implications to what types of decisions we make as it relates to HVAC. And then, the second thing is there's a lot of things in the chat about consultants saying no. One of the things that I would like to say is, it's your building. You need to really push. If someone is telling you no, they probably have not done it before. These are not, bleeding edge technologies. These are things that have been around a long time. There are ways to make these solutions work almost always. And again, it's not going to happen designing in a vacuum. It does have to take into account energy efficiency, or else you're going to pay out the nose for a lot of heating and cooling you don't need. But if you can do envelopes right, if you can make other improvements to the building, you can make these things pencil out. And so you need to be, it's your building, you're paying for it, and really leaning on your consultants to give what you're asking for is a key thing.
Awesome. I love it. Julia, your big takeaway for the audience here.
Sure. I would just say from our perspective in New York City, there's so much work to do. There's so much work being done all the time. And I think this project and this initiative has really highlighted that, like, when money is being spent, we need to make sure that it's being spent in the right areas. So putting the big dollars in electrification and then prioritizing where we're doing it so that we actually make sure we see the biggest improvement in air quality indoor and outdoor for the folks who have the biggest impacts of asthma. Yeah, that's what I think.
Great, Emma, I'm going to pass the baton over to you. Do you want to start us off with the next question from the audience?
Sure thing. So this first one is actually for Erica. So going back up to the top here. So we all know that you are a public health scientist and that you've been applying your expertise to K-12 school design for many years now. So this audience question was asking you to reflect on how often and whether the concepts of electrification and decarbonization more broadly come up in these conversations when we're talking solutions to the health and performance concerns that schools are facing. So from your experience, does electrification and decarbonization come up? If not, how do we bridge that gap?
I would say that we're at a point right now where those topics are coming up a lot more than health is. I would say that health is not as easily quantifiable as energy and cost savings. And so it's more of bridging our gap to be thinking about what are the health ramifications and what makes the most sense for our communities. I think this is something where we can talk about decarbonization, but it kind of gives me a little bit of like a back to the 70s where we had an energy crisis and we started removing all of our windows from our classrooms. And so we really have to be having sort of a holistic conversation about health. And that's why I really feel, and I appreciate sort of me getting to go first, in the sense that if we're going to have a conversation about decarbonization, we also have to be thinking about this in terms of climate adaptation and what are sort of the acute and short-term benefits of making some of these changes and investments, that it's not just a sort of a payout long-term down the line, but also things that, especially with schools across, New England and even to Cincinnati closing for extreme heat, we know those things will be felt pretty quickly. And it's an equity issue too. Who gets to have a decarbonization conversation is not for everybody. And so it is about how we're going to kind of lift all boats as we're talking about this.
Great. Wyatt, I've got a question for you, and it builds on some of what Erica was saying earlier too. So, when I think about districts that are building new schools right now, I mean, here I am on my high horse talking about how we can't miss this opportunity. And yet, as you know, probably better than anyone in this room, construction costs are really high, right? And community leaders are understandably sensitive to increasing tax bills. What would you say to a school building committee that is contemplating a gas boiler in new construction today as a response to those, very real, very challenging fiscal considerations? I mean, Erica talked about a Ferrari. Can we afford the Ferrari?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great question. And, there's some legitimacy to that question. And there's also, there are things happening that, you can be wary of, that so you can avoid ballooning costs that, may be more figurative than literal. And so, I would say first and foremost, I think there was a lot of great observations in the chat about energy conservation and other things that can be implemented into design so that you're, right sizing HVAC systems. So you may not need the Tesla Cybertruck to get the work job done. You might be able to get a Nissan Leaf or something of that nature, a more economy electrified system to meet your needs. And so, first and foremost, when I talk about managing cost, I think that's a big part of it. Are your consultants, is your design team, are you as owners engaged in a conversation to figure out how to shift costs around so that you can, make an economic decision? The second thing is, the reality is that there is inflation in the construction market right now, and costs are ballooning, and being able, in decades past where you really could almost always keep these systems within budget, that can be tougher to do right now. And there is a premium associated with these systems. And so leveraging the ITC, I can't emphasize that enough, these new tax credits that are available. You may not be able to go geothermal, and so your tax credit options may be limited, but if that's an option, if you have the land area, if you've minimized your loads enough to where you don't need as large of a well field as maybe what's for the standard construction, you can leverage those tax credits, and that can be in transformational as far as the financials of that project, making it the lowest first cost option. So I would make sure that you've explored all options if you're going down that route. The other thing that I would add is if you think about that 30-year time horizon that I said, where I showed a heat pump compared to a natural gas boiler. If you're putting in a boiler today, one thing that it's hard to quantify, but something to keep in the back of your mind is what will the regulation environment look like in 20 years, in 30 years? In 10 years. And so how could those regulations impact the cost of operating a boiler when you could have switched to electrified option and had more control over the pollution associated with that technology?
Thanks, Wyatt. So I think I'm going to jump in here and have us switch gears a little bit to talk about ventilation, since we've been heavy on the electrification side here. So Julia, if you'll join us for this question. The New York City commitment is very focused on electrification of space heating equipment, but as we've talked about today, ventilation is key to student health as well. So curious if you could give us a little bit of the details on how ventilation fits into this decarbonization plan, and how do you see electrification unlocking those complementary efforts on ventilation?
Yeah, of course. And there's a lot more detail of the actual retrofit plan than I could fit into 10 minutes, but the electrification projects absolutely include upgraded mechanical ventilation in classrooms and in assembly spaces. There's also, we understand the link between adequate ventilation and performance, and the school department makes sure that what we have is optimized, and what we're doing is providing more ventilation as we're moving forward. I would also note that these projects, I saw a lot of questions in the chat around efficiency, and the schools that we're working on to electrify absolutely include efficiency measures as well, to optimize the mechanical system. And then there's a lot of work that's being done across the board, again, around sort of optimization and right timing. So like if we're doing work on a roof, making sure that we're upgrading the insulation on the roof so that it has the maximum efficiency components, and same things with windows. When we have a new roof, we want to make sure we put in solar. So I think with a portfolio of this size, a lot of the work is around planning and strategizing how to make the best use of sort of existing work that will go on so that we can incorporate ventilation, electrification, and efficiency as well.
Great, thank you, Julia. Back over to you, Sarah. We might have time for one or two more questions.
Great. I guess I'll go back to Wyatt here for one more question on the cost side. Are the costs for Buckley that you presented, are those just for the ground source heat pump system, and how do you think about that within a broader cost environment? Like, were you able to deliver that project, which was net zero, a Renofit, and ground source heat pump? Like, how did the overall project cost per square foot kind of compare with a conventional approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the costs in the life cycle analysis I presented were specifically for the HVAC equipment. So I think, around $4 million upfront for the base case. And I think we ended up around $5 million. So about $1 million premium in total to upgrade to the HVAC system, plus geothermal, all the ventilation improvements, all the things that we did at that school. When it was all said and done. And so the total construction cost, I think, came in around 27 million. I could be misquoting that. I'm not entirely sure, but I believe that's correct. So the well field itself was around $850,000 for that school. When you take into account what you're leaving behind when you switch to a geothermal system. So that's a big part of getting into the weeds of the cost estimate. You no longer need the boiler, you no longer need the cooling tower, you no longer need the natural gas service to the building potentially if you're fully electrified. There's a lot of things that kind of get reduced from those costs that can be missed. So all of those are factored in to the life cycle analysis, as well as maintenance cost savings, water cost savings, and then operational cost savings from energy savings, obviously. And then with the tax credit, in the case where we could have potentially, if this had happened a year later and Buckley could have leveraged the ITC, the way that is working, because I saw a bunch of questions in the chat about it. And so the reason that K through 12 public entities, they're tax exempt normally, the way that you can receive those tax credits is through what's called a direct payment. And so essentially what that's going to look like is the federal government is going to be cutting checks for the percents that you normally would have gotten from off of your tax bill. You're just getting that off of the cost of the system. And so there's a lot of guidance that's going to come out from the IRS here shortly, kind of explaining the details of how that payment process will look like. But that's the way that it will be implemented. And so that's how that would have impacted the front end financials of the system. Did that answer the question?
Perfect. Thanks, Wyatt. So you took us straight to the end of the hour. So I think that's our last question of the day. Thank you again to our three speakers for joining us, and thank you all for joining us as well. We hope that you are leaving feeling motivated to take action. Give that full report in our one-pagers a read, especially focusing in on those recommendations towards the end. We would love to hear from you too. So here are mine and Sarah's email addresses. We'd be happy to connect you with speakers if needed. And again, you will receive a recording of this webinar soon by email. So thank you again and have a great day, everybody.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Charged Up, everything you need to know about EV charging. This is a special webinar that we're doing during National Drive Electric Week to celebrate National Drive Electric Week. And for those of you who don't know, National Drive Electric Week is a week to talk about electric vehicles and do some education and events surrounding electric vehicles. This webinar will be done by myself. My name is Devin DeLibero. I am the Electric Vehicle Program Coordinator on the Drive Green program at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. And I'll also be joined by my colleague, Anna, who will introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Anna Vanderspeck, and I'm the Electric Vehicle Program Director at Green Energy Consumers.
And now the two other folks that you'll see on the call today, I have them introduce themselves in just a sec, but they are going to be there to answer questions primarily in the chat. So you will probably see their names, but I will give them the opportunity to turn their cameras off if they don't want to have them on for the duration of the presentation. So Ezra, if you would just like to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ezra, and I am the Electric Vehicle Program Associate at Green Energy Consumers.
And then Elizabeth, please.
Hello, I'm an electrification assistant at the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources. I help run the Drive EV rebate program and can help answer any questions about that.
Perfect. All right, everybody. So if you want to turn your cameras off now, you are more than welcome to do so. You might see Anna's face pop up again halfway through the presentation.
Before I go, I wanted to do one quick shout out to folks from Winchester joining us as part of the Winchester Climate Solutions Week. Welcome. And now I'll disappear.
Great. She beat me to it. Okay, so here we go. Like most webinars, everyone is muted to avoid any background noise. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We will have Elizabeth and Ezra on standby to answer any questions in the Q&A. And also, we will have time to answer some questions aloud at the end. This webinar will be recorded and shared after the fact with a follow-up email. So if you have any questions that are lingering, please feel free to respond to me and I will get to your questions via email. Our mission at Green Energy Consumers is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. We do that in a myriad of different ways through our program work and our policy and advocacy work. Through our program work, like programs like Drive Green, Drive Green helps us accomplish this mission by getting electric cars on the road instead of gasoline-powered cars. EVs charged in New England can cut emissions by 75% per mile traveled. So the environmental reason to switch is pretty compelling. And since the grid is getting cleaner every year, the environmental benefits will continue to grow. Electric cars are a new technology, so making the transition from gas to electric can be intimidating at first, since charging an electric car is pretty different from how gas is pumped, which is why we are presenting here today and telling you all about charging. Next slide, please. So in this webinar, we will cover how charging works and talk about all the background information with that. We'll talk about level 1 and level 2 charging to start off, because there's 3 different levels of charging. So we'll start with the first 2. Then we'll talk about installing a charging unit at your home, the different public charging networks, and then DC fast charging or level 3 charging. Before we continue, I just want to let you know that you do not have to be a technical expert to drive an electric vehicle. This certainly is handy information to know, but you can just know that, like, if you're looking for an EV that you like the way this car looks, you like this color, it has a good enough range to suit your needs, and just basic things about charging, but you don't need to know and memorize all the intricacies of what we're going to tell you today. This is just for folks who want to know those things. Next slide, please. Okay, so we will kick it off now with how charging works. Electricity is not always the most intuitive thing to talk about, but knowing a few key terms can really help understand what's going on with charging. So let's all get on the same page in terms of vocabulary. This is not a class in electrical engineering, but if you're going to see these terms thrown around, it's good to have a general sense of what they mean. It helps to put all of this in terms of something that you can visualize more easily, like water flowing through the pipe. So keep that visual in mind while we're talking. Voltage is the electrical potential determined by the power source. Household outlets deliver 120 volts AC, but you can install higher voltage outlets too, usually to support appliances that need a lot of power. High voltage means higher capacity for electrical flow. Current is easiest to understand. It's the speed of flowing electrons exactly analogous to the speed of water flowing through a pipe. How much current flows out depends on how much power is required for whatever you're using. Devices automatically draw whatever current they need, and circuit breakers make sure that the current is managed to be at a safe level so that the current doesn't surge up and overload electrical wires. Power is the one we really care about. Power is energy delivered in a given amount of time, so higher power means faster charging, generally, but it depends on voltage and current. Increasing voltage or current will increase power. Finally, energy describes how much storage capacity is actually in the battery. Energy is what translates to miles you can drive. It's the capacity to do work that is measured in kilowatt hours. So in this analogy, current or amps times potential or volts equals power or watts. So just keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Next, we are going to talk about driving range and charging speed because it's the two biggest questions that people have of electric vehicles. The first is how far can I go? So the size of the battery determines how much energy you can store in the car. The more energy, the more driving range. Efficiency describes how good the car is at converting energy into miles driven. Bigger cars are usually less efficient, but efficiency can vary depending on road conditions, driving style, and how fast you drive. Unlike gas cars, EVs are more efficient at city speeds and stop-and-go traffic. The weather. It's surprising how big of an impact It's surprising how big of an impact the ambient temperature makes. Batteries have an ideal operating temperature. In the winter, you need to use energy from the battery to keep it at a correct temperature, which cuts into the range. In the summer, however, when weather is nice, you'll get way more miles out of your car than is stated by the EPA estimated range for any particular vehicle. The second one is how fast can I charge? Power source. Charging is basically the process of transferring energy from an outlet to the battery for storage. So the power source is a major factor that limits how fast you can charge. You can't draw more power than is available from the source. The other limiting factors are the onboard charger, which is located inside the car itself. Terminology might be a little confusing here because generally when people say charger, they mean the cable, but an onboard charger is not the cable or charging station, which is in the green in the diagram. The onboard charger is located in the car itself. Before energy can be stored in the battery, the power has to be converted from AC power, which is the power that the outlet spits out, to DC power, which is the power that the devices use. That's what the onboard charger does. So even if you're plugged into a charging station that delivers a ton of power, the car can only process all of that power so quickly. And this is especially important to think about when it comes to DC fast charging, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And if you have any more questions on this, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Finally, weather affects charging speeds too, in the same way it affects driving range. Next slide, please. Next, we're going to talk about the types of charging. So let's start with level 1, which means using a regular household outlet for your charging needs. All EVs come with a cable that plugs the car into a regular outlet. It's like charging a smartphone. The ports for this type of charging are pictured below on the left. Most EVs have a J1772 port, which is the top port for level 1 charging and level 2 charging, except for Tesla, which uses the North American Charging Standard port, also called NACS. However, soon more manufacturers will be using NACS, but we'll talk about that later in this presentation. For now, know that NACS ports can be used for all 3 levels of charging. Household outlets don't deliver a lot of power. You can get 4 miles of range per hour of charging. That can really vary between 2 and 6, depending on how cold it is, but 4 is a good year-round average. So 4 miles of range in an hour sounds pretty slow, and it is. 4 miles of range per hour of charging means it would take 10 hours to recharge overnight if you drive about 40 miles a day, which is the average distance for Americans to drive on a daily basis. This is important to know because it kind of helps you figure out what your driving needs actually are and what your charging needs are. And as a reminder, you're not going to be sitting there with your car. It's going to take you like 10 seconds to plug it in, and then you're going to go about your day or your night. So it's really not too much of an inconvenience. Next slide, please. However, while 40 miles might seem plenty for some people, we recognize that there are also a lot of folks who drive more than 40 miles a day, so they might want a better option. Level 2 charging is a way to make charging much faster and makes driving an EV more convenient and more practical for those who drive longer distances. Level 2 charging uses the same ports as level 1, which is the J1772 for most vehicles, and NACS for Tesla and some upcoming vehicles we'll talk about later. As an example, say you drive 250 miles a day, you can recharge the whole car overnight by plugging into a level 2 station. If you can just click, there you go. So that's pointing to the charging unit that's installed in someone's garage. Charging stations are also known as EVSE, or electric vehicle supply equipment. It's the cable in the box that connects your car to the 240 volt outlet and manages the electric current running between them. It prevents current from your car it prevents current from flowing if the charging port and cable aren't properly connected. So it's essentially safety equipment to protect your car and the electrical system. One side of the cable has the J1772 port and the other side plugs into an outlet. If you look closely, it's a 4-pronged 240 volt outlet, different from what you use at home and for most appliances. Level 2 charging is faster than level 1 because the charging station is plugged into a 240 volt outlet that delivers more voltage, and also the charging station can manage higher current safely. So both voltage and current allow more power to be delivered to the car via charging, which decreases charge time. Next slide, please. Now, here's what I was referencing before about the Tesla Charging Partnership and the North American Charging Standard, or NACS. So like we said before, Tesla uses one port for all 3 levels of charging. And in the last couple years or so, they took the patent and opened it up for their charging port in the hopes of becoming that, like the name states, the North American Charging Standard, so more manufacturers would adopt their charging ports. So far, we have quite a few manufacturers who have agreed to adopt the North American Charging Standard port, and those are Ford, Rivian, GM, Acura, Fisker, Mercedes-Benz, Nissan, Honda, Jaguar, and Polestar and Volvo. Now, this is going to change. It's probably going to be a list that grows very quickly over time, but for right now, these are the manufacturers who have agreed. What this generally means is that most of these manufacturers will follow the following timetable. In spring of 2024, all of these manufacturers listed will have adapters available for their vehicles that are currently on the roads, which means that they can use any of Tesla's 12,000 plus supercharger stations across the North America, which is huge because a huge advantage of having a Tesla is the charging station network. So it opens up a lot of different charging opportunities for folks who wouldn't normally have that. So, I mean, the charging infrastructure without NACS is pretty extensive, but this is even greater and it gives you more opportunities for charging. After you're given an adapter, that's all well and good for existing customers. In 2025, all the partnered vehicles mentioned above will come standard with their new cars with the NACS port installed, which will most likely get rid of the other charging ports they're currently using, and they'll just use the one NACS port. So that'll be a huge advantage. I think it will be what the name is, which will be the North American Charging Standard. So when considering an electric vehicle, used or new, consider whether or not that manufacturer has aligned itself with the North American Charging Standard. Next slide, please. Just now going back to talk a little bit more about what it means to charge at level 2. So level 2, you are limited by the onboard charger capacity, which we talked about, which means you want to look for a car that has a higher onboard charger capacity if you feel like you really need to charge quickly at a level 2 rate. So some examples of what those cars could look like are in this chart. So we have cars that are 7.7 kilowatts and above that will charge anywhere from 25 to over 30 miles of range per hour. And if that's something you need, definitely look into a car like the Chevy Bolt, the Hyundai Kona, or just about any of the Tesla models. There are other cars to mention. So the BMW i3 it has an onboard charger capacity of 7.4 kilowatts, and that's actually not so bad because you get about 24 miles of range per hour. Same for the Kia Niro EV. As you go further down, obviously the maximum level of charging speed will go down. But what's important to note here is also, generally speaking, plug-in hybrid cars will have a lower rate of onboard charger capacity because they are meant to rely on that gas backup. So the charging speed isn't as important in those cars as with all electric vehicles. So just know that it might take a little bit more time to charge your plug-in hybrid unless you have an onboard charger capacity that is much greater than its average. Next slide, please. Okay, so just as a recap, even if the car can charge quickly, it can't draw more power. Sorry, it can't draw more than what the station can dole out. So if you plug a car with a 7.2 kilowatt onboard charger into a 6.6 kilowatt station, it will charge at a 6.6 kilowatt rate. Next slide, please. But if you take the same car with a 7.2 kilowatt onboard charger and plug it into a 10 kilowatt station, it will charge at the at a rate of 7.2 kilowatts. So in theory, automakers could improve this figure, but that would add weight and complexity to the car, which would cut into efficiency and therefore range. So really, it's all about balance. Next slide, please. So I'm going to conclude my talking points with charging at home and on the go, and Anna's going to take over also within this section. So just note that. So charging is different than a gas car, and part of making the switch to an electric car is changing your perspective on what's convenient. We're used to refueling gas cars, but electric cars have their own benefits. The median range for a gas-powered car is 412 miles. Which is good, and electric cars are now starting to catch up. In the next couple of years, they're trending at least 300 miles of range or more for electric vehicles, for all electric vehicles. So, for an example, if you drive 40 miles a day, then you have to refuel once every 10 days. You probably wait until you're close to empty and then take a detour to the gas station. It takes about 5 minutes to fill up, plus whatever time it takes you to make the detour. When you use public charging stations, it's generally somewhere you will stop anyways, like the grocery store or the gym. So it's not really much of an inconvenience as far as a detour goes. Now, with an all-electric vehicle, let's say you drive, you get about 250 miles on a full charge. If you charge at home, like most people do, then when you step out of your car, you simply just unroll the charging cable right then and there and plug it in, and it takes about 10 seconds instead of waiting till you're nearly empty and then going and finding a gas station. Charging is a little bit more convenient in that respect. Next slide, please. So charging at home can be very simple. The first thing you're going to want to do is figure out what your charging level needs are based on your charging habits and the range of your vehicle. So if you're wanting a level 1 or a level 2, and we'll talk about how you can figure that out in just a sec. With the next slide, please. So we here at Green Energy Consumers have come up with a guide to walk you through the process of what you think your charging needs are, especially at home. So this guide will help you determine whether or not you need if you just are fine with level 1 charging, or if you would really like level 2, and how to install a unit in your home. So 1 will help you determine your charging needs. 2 will help you pick out a charging station unit I want to stress that we're not going to recommend any charging station unit, but we'll give you some guidelines of what to look for when you're looking for your own charging station unit. And then we'll also tell you what you need an electrician for, and you do need an electrician for this, but it's not a super cost prohibitive thing to do. It's with the electrician's work and the cost of the unit, it should only cost you about $1,200 for the whole process. Now that's with no other electrical issues that need to be fixed in order to install this. So it should be fairly simple. Next slide, please. And now you might be thinking, well, that's great, but I don't live in a single family home. I live in an apartment or a condo. We also have a guide for you as well. This is something that you can hand to your landlord or whomever to say, this is why it's such a great amenity. This is why you should install it for us. And we also have another guide that tells the landlords how to go about this process and if there's any incentives that they can take advantage of to install these charging station units for their residents. And I believe I'm going to now hand it over to Anna.
Thanks, Devin. Before I jump into the next slide, I'll say that there are lots of incentives, or there are existing incentives and new incentives coming soon to help bring down that cost of installing charging, and we'll talk about that later. So don't fret. There's ways to bring that $1,200 down. But first, at this point in the conversation, we often get the question, how much does it actually cost to charge? And for that, we have this analysis that we do basically on a quarterly basis, where we look at the actual current electricity prices from the 3 big investor-owned utilities in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So that's National Grid, Eversource, and Rhode Island Energy. And we take a look at the current supply and delivery costs, and then do some math assuming you're driving a vehicle with the efficiency of the Chevy Bolt, which is pretty average across different electric vehicles, and calculate how much you'll have to pay per mile in electricity and then per mile in gas. So National Grid, Eversource, and Rhode Island actually have pretty close electricity prices right now. They're all 30 or 31 cents per kilowatt hour. That is down significantly from the very unusual spike that we saw last winter that came as a result of the war in Ukraine. So our electricity prices are a little bit closer to normal for this region. You can see that each of the electric utilities has a different time period for these prices. They're always updated once a year, so there's 6-month chunks. So we're right at the end of that 6-month chunk for National Grid and Rhode Island Energy. And about halfway through for Eversource. But if you take those prices and assume the efficiency of a Chevy Bolt, you get to about 9 cents per mile if you're driving on electricity. If you're driving on the average gas-powered car, that price is 15 cents per mile. And we calculated that using the average gas price in Massachusetts as of earlier this week, which was $3.77 per gallon. And we're assuming an efficiency of 25.4 miles per gallon, which is the average fleet efficiency right now. And if you want to do your own math, plugging in different numbers, we link to the methodology document on this slide. But basically what this math shows us is that right now, if you're driving electric in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, you're saving about 6 cents a mile on electricity, and that can add up over the year. However, you may very well be a customer of National Grid, Eversource, or Rhode Island Energy, but be paying a slightly different price for your electricity, depending on what supplier you've signed up with. So on this slide, we'll show you how to actually calculate what you're paying yourself using this screenshot of an electricity bill. So we'll walk through the different parts of this. The first thing to note on the sample bill is that there's a fixed customer charge. So whether you're a customer of Eversource, National Grid, or Rhode Island Energy, there's a fixed charge that you pay every month that is independent of how many kilowatt hours of electricity you use. So on this sample bill, it's $10. If you have a different utility, it might be slightly different. But just a heads up that that's there, but not part of the calculation we're doing today. Secondly, if you check out the line where it says supplier, you'll notice that the supplier in this case is the aggregation program in Cambridge, Massachusetts. not Eversource. So if you are on basic service, you'll see basic service of your utility in this line. But in this case, it's the Cambridge Community Electricity Program supplied by Direct Energy. What that means is that this generation charge that you pay per kilowatt hour is different from what customers who are on the basic service rate pay. So this is an important part to check out on your bill to figure out what are you actually paying for generation or supply. In other words, the actual kilowatt hours of electricity that you're consuming. So on this bill, you can see that it's 13.669 cents per kilowatt hour. That, however, is not the only per kilowatt hour charge. We also have to take into account delivery, and that is all of these charges. So these are all also per kilowatt hour charges, but they serve different purposes. So distribution and transition are the electric utility recouping the costs of maintaining all the wires that bring the electricity to you from the generator. And then there's lots of other charges, some of which are negative, that have to do with different policy priorities. But if you add all of those charges together, you see that the delivery costs are 14.622 cents per kilowatt hour. So if you add those together, you can see that the cost to charge an electric vehicle in this household would be 28.91 cents per kilowatt hour instead of the 30 or 31 cents we saw on the previous slide. So if you've never taken a look at your electric bill, definitely pull it up. You shouldn't see anything that's wildly different from what you've seen here, but because an increasing number of residents in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island are part of community aggregation programs, it's definitely a good idea to look if you want to do your own math. But to simplify all of this a little bit, we'll take an example of the Chevy Bolt. Again, we refer to this one a lot, but the Chevy Bolt right now has a battery of 65 kilowatt hours. That's the energy capacity of the battery. And if that's completely full, the EPA range estimate is 259 miles. So if we're assuming that you are going to charge the Bolt up completely and then drive for 100 miles, we've done some math on what that would cost you depending on your electric utility. So basically it costs about $7, somewhere between $7 and $8, whether you're a National Grid, Eversource, or Rhode Island Energy customer, to drive a Chevy Bolt 100 miles. And if you take a 30 mile per gallon car at $3.56 per gallon, it would cost $11. And if it's slightly less efficient, that same 25.4 miles per gallon we cited earlier, it would be $14. So this is an illustration of how it is really cheaper to drive a mile or 100 miles on electricity rather than gas. And if you've attended one of our Electric Vehicle 101 presentations, you know that the underlying principle here is that electric vehicles are much more efficient. Gas-powered cars waste a lot of the energy that is in every gallon of gasoline, and there's a whole lot less of that waste with EVs, which is why they're so much more efficient and cheaper to drive. We've talked a little bit about charging at home, but lots of people do charge on the go, and there's a lot more public charging than most people realize. So if you're thinking about getting an electric car, it would be worth thinking about where do you regularly drive and where do you regularly park, and just looking to see if there's public charging nearby. The resource that we recommend to find that charging is called PlugShare. It's a platform or a brand neutral platform where all of the different electric vehicle charging stations from all of the different networks are just on one map. So you can type in an address and it'll show you the charging stations that are nearby. And when you click on one of these little flags, it'll show you information like how many chargers are there at that location, where are they exactly, do you have to pay for parking, or do you have to pay for kilowatt hours, or do you have to pay by the hour? Basically gives you all the information you need. This is particularly useful because unlike gas stations, EV charging stations are often not obvious unless you know what they look like. So the picture in the top right shows you what a pretty classic level 2 charging station looks like. It's basically just a pedestal with 2 cords attached to it. But if you're in a giant Walmart parking lot or a Stop and Shop or something, it's not necessarily immediately obvious where those charging stations are. So the app can help you find those stations. The screenshot at the bottom here is a screenshot of that PlugShare resource. it looks like there's not a whole lot of charging, but this is one of those websites where if you zoom in, it'll show you more and more detail. And there's tons more public charging out there than people think at supermarkets and gas stations and gyms and libraries and all sorts of places where you might be parking your car for some time anyway. So definitely check out PlugShare to see what's around you. So as I mentioned before, we like PlugShare because it's a platform that is brand neutral, but it is important to talk about some of the brands that are out there. So there are lots of different companies that are building out charging station networks where you have to be a member or basically sign up for an account with them to use their charging stations, or you can roll up and just use a credit card and use their charging station. Some of the ones that are most prevalent in the Northeast are ChargePoint, which has those orange charging stations like you saw on the last slide. And then Electrify America and EVgo have much larger DC fast charging stations that we'll talk about. But then there's lots of other companies like Volta and Greenlots and Blink that have charging stations around New England. You'll sometimes hear us refer to these stations as smart charging stations. And what that means is that they are hooked up to the internet, either via Wi-Fi or via cell service, so that there's real-time monitoring of charging. So this is needed if you're pulling up to a station where you're going to pay, either with a credit card or with an app. That means that that's a smart charging station that's hooked up to enable that kind of payment. But the other benefit is that you can get a lot of information about these charging stations if you go into the individual apps of some of these charging networks, which we'll show you in a minute. But by going into their app, you can see, is this charging station in use right now, or can I reserve a slot for later? So most of the stations you'll see on that PlugShare map are smart charging stations. There are still some quote unquote dumb stations out there, which means they're non-networked. They don't have smartphone integration. They're not hooked up to Wi-Fi. They're basically just a source of electricity where you can roll up and charge. A lot of these are some of the earlier stations that were installed, usually in like municipal lots or libraries as part of an sustainability initiative. So those are not easy to find if you go to ChargePoint's website or EVgo or Volta, but if you go to PlugShare, you can find those if you're trying to plan out a route. So to illustrate how all of this might work, here's an example of if you want to go to Roger Williams Park Zoo in Rhode Island, how to figure out the charging situation. So we would recommend that you start with PlugShare, and that's what the screenshot in the middle is. So if you pull that up on PlugShare, you can see, okay, there's a J1772 level 2 charging station at the Roger Williams Park Zoo that belongs to the ChargePoint network. You can see that there's a park nearby, that there's restrooms, that there's dining. You can see that it's open 24/7, and you can see that there are 4 ChargePoint charging spots, and it tells you that they're just to the left of the main entrance. So that's already a lot of information that that app can tell you. But then if you want to understand a little bit more, you can pull up the ChargePoint app to learn more. So there it'll tell you that there are 6.6 kilowatt chargers. It'll tell you that they're free to use. It'll tell you the hours again, and often it'll tell you if the station is in use right now, and if the site host has enabled it, it'll allow you to reserve a charging time later in the day. So it is maybe a little confusing at the beginning to have so many different apps, but we really recommend PlugShare as your starting point, and then you can turn to the other resources as needed. But honestly, a lot of people get by with PlugShare and then just rolling up and using a credit card at the actual station. So far we've been talking mostly about level 2 public charging, which is the type that you would do if you're at the gym or at the grocery store and you know you're going to be there for an hour or two, and you can plug in and do some what's called opportunity charging and just fill up your battery a little bit more. But fast charging is obviously something that really matters if you're going to go on a road trip. So for this section, we'll talk entirely about fast charging. So the first thing I want to do is clarify what the sort of technical difference is between normal charging, level 1 and level 2, and DC fast charging. So DC stands for direct current, and this graphic explains a little bit the situation. So if you're doing level 1 or level 2 charging, you're receiving current as AC from a normal household outlet. And on this little graphic, you can see that that current is going into an onboard charger, which converts it into DC to actually fill the battery. If you're doing DC fast charging, you can bypass that step because the electric vehicle supply equipment is delivering power in DC. So you can go straight into the battery, and that allows you to charge at a higher rate and charge faster. So there are right now 3 different types of plugs for DC fast charging. But as Devin mentioned earlier in the presentation, this is starting to really coalesce around the third. So the first on the side here, starting at the top, is the J1772 combo. It's also known as the CCS plug. And if you remember what the J1772 for level 2 charging looks like, it's basically that top circle. And then the combo means you've got these 2 prongs at the bottom, which allow you to do DC fast charging. So on some vehicles, you have a little flap over those 2 prongs that you open up so that you can do DC fast charging. This, up until basically this year, was the standard adopted by European and American manufacturers for DC fast charging. The other standard has been the CHAdeMO standard, which is shown in the middle. You can see that it's fundamentally a different shape. And that, up until recently, was the standard adopted by Asian manufacturers. So mostly Nissan vehicles have the CHAdeMO plug. As Devin mentioned, Tesla has opened up the information about its charging standard, the North American Charging Standard, and many, many manufacturers are partnering with Tesla to adopt this standard moving forward. So if you currently have an electric vehicle, then you know what type of charging your vehicle can do, and those apps will find the appropriate charging stations for you. And if you have a vehicle currently that is of one of these manufacturers that's striking up these agreements, some point next year, you'll be able to get an adapter that will allow you to use Tesla charging stations. Moving forward, a lot of the new vehicles that are going to come out are just going to have the North American Charging Standard, which is a good thing in the sense that it's simplifying. We won't have to talk about 3 different plug types anymore. It'll just be, this is the DC fast charging plug for most manufacturers. Often the question we get with DC fast charging is how fast is fast? And the answer there is that it depends, of course, as always, on lots of different things. So the first thing that matters is the station power. So a lot of the charging stations that are DC fast charging stations that were built in the last couple of years were somewhere between like 50 and 70 kilowatts. So that's how much power they could output. Thanks to the federal bipartisan infrastructure law, all of the new charging stations that are going to be installed using federal funds will have a minimum of 150 kilowatts. And there's increasingly stations that can even charge at 350 kilowatts, which is just enormous. So the first thing is that the ability of the station to output power will determine how fast you can charge. And that's what this little graph on the right is about. So you can see that if you're charging at 50 kilowatts, you can expect maybe 90 miles in half an hour of charging. But if you go up to 150 kilowatts, it's 200 miles in that same amount of time. That is an estimate because a lot of other factors determine how much you can charge, but that's sort of a rough guide for you. The second thing that determines how fast you can charge is the state of charge. So we have a whole slide dedicated to this in a moment, but if a battery is basically empty, it will charge a lot faster than if it's very full, because one thing batteries want to avoid is getting too hot. So if a battery is over 80% full, it will slow down how fast it's charging to maintain a beneficial temperature. So how full your battery already is determines how fast you can fast charge. The total battery capacity will obviously impact how fast you can charge. If you've got a bigger battery, it's going to take longer to fill than if you've got a smaller battery. As Devin previously mentioned, temperature matters. So if it's very, very cold or very, very hot, your charging will slow down. And then the vehicle efficiency, or at what rate the vehicle can actually receive DC power, will also impact how fast you can charge. Here's a graphic showing the the way that different manufacturers advertise how fast you can DC fast charge on their websites. So these are just some sample cars, and you can see that the Nissan Leaf, which has one of the lower DC fast charging capabilities on the market right now, it can only receive up to 50 kilowatts. It advertises being able to charge 120 miles in 40 minutes. But if you go to the other extreme and look at the Hyundai Ioniq 5, which is one of the newer vehicles with nearly twice as much range, with over twice as much range, I should say, it can do 242 miles in 18 minutes if it's plugged into a 350 kilowatt charger. So there is a big range with electric vehicles and how fast they can DC fast charge. We have this information on our shopping tools. So if it's very important to you to have an EV that can charge very fast on DC fast charging, you'll be able to see on our site which vehicles can receive power at over 150 or up to 350 kilowatts. So as I mentioned 2 slides ago, the current state of charge of the battery will impact how fast you can charge. And here we have a sample charging session for a Chevy Bolt to kind of illustrate this. So the first half hour of charging, if your battery starts relatively empty, will always be the fastest. So if you look at this graphic, from 5% full to 43% full takes half an hour, and in that half an hour, you can add 98 miles of range. Once we get to those 98 miles, maybe we're like a little bit more than halfway full now, or actually we're 43% full. The vehicle will already start to ramp down the rate of charging just a little bit to continue to protect the battery. So in that second half hour, you get slightly less power. You get 90 miles instead of 98. And then right around the 80% mark, the vehicle will really ramp down the rate of charging. So in this case, when we get to 74%, even though the vehicle can charge at 50 kilowatts, it'll say we have to slow down and start charging at 25 kilowatts instead, again, to avoid adding too much unnecessary heat. And that means in that last hour, you'll only add 51 miles compared to the 98 miles you added in the first 30 minutes. So the rate of charging really slows down towards the end when you do DC fast charging. What that means in practice is if you're doing DC fast charging just around town because you've depleted your battery and you want to fill it up again, you can fill it up to 80% and just be like, okay, I'm done. That's good enough for now. If you're on a road trip, you will want to think a little bit about, okay, do I want to spend that extra hour at this DC fast charging station to get up to 100%? Or is 80% good enough and I can go on my way and charge at the next charging station? The good news is that there are apps to help you figure this out. So depending on the vehicle, you might use the onboard route planning function in the vehicle, or there's also a resource called A Better Route Planner, which you can find online or as an app to build out a road trip. And basically that will calculate for you if it makes more sense to spend a little bit longer at this rest stop or move on to the next one. So this slide is complicated, but in practice, there's an app that will do the math for you. The DC fast charging network is building out rapidly and will continue to build out rapidly in the next couple of years for lots of different reasons. So this is a screenshot again from PlugShare that shows you all the DC fast charging stations in this area. Again, it's kind of hard to read because you need to be able to zoom in to see where all those flags are. But basically, DC fast charging stations are found generally along high traffic corridors and highways. So at some rest stops where there's a gas station, there's also a DC fast charging station, or even at rest stops where there isn't a gas station, you might find a DC fast charging station in the same place you'll find a McDonald's or a place with vending machines or some other rest stop. Increasingly, there are also DC fast charging stations in rideshare hubs for Uber and Lyft drivers. This is picking up a little bit faster in other parts of the country than in New England, but we know that Uber and Lyft and companies like that are thinking about this and working on this. And then finally, you'll find DC fast charging stations in places where it's really hard for people to charge at home because they don't have off-street parking or they live in an apartment or condo. So you'll see these in sort of dense urban areas increasingly to make it easier for people like that to be able to charge. So on a day-to-day basis, to summarize, you're much more likely to rely on level 2 charging than DC fast charging. Most people really just use DC fast charging for those longer road trips, but there is a lot more DC fast charging than most people realize too. As I mentioned, there's more DC fast charging coming, and that's for a couple of different reasons. So the first is that in that bipartisan infrastructure law, the federal government set up something called the NEVI program, which stands for National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. And basically that means that each state in the country is receiving funding based on a formula from the federal government to put towards building out DC fast charging so that there's DC fast charging every 50 miles on important highways. So Massachusetts is getting $63.5 million for that. Rhode Island is getting $23 million for that. And that means that in the next couple of years, there's going to be a lot more DC fast charging being built out along highways. I believe both states right now are in the stage of issuing a request for proposals to solicit proposals from installers to actually get these stations in the ground. In Massachusetts, we are grateful that there are other resources available too. So National Grid, Unitil, and Eversource were together approved to spend about $400 million on all types of electric vehicle charging over the next 4 or 5 years. We've had webinars on that, and we've got lots of information on our website, but basically a good chunk of that will go towards DC fast charging and make it possible for more locations to install these charging stations. And that's funding that complements or goes above and beyond the federal funding that I've already mentioned. And then also last year's climate law allocated $50 million to an EV infrastructure fund in Massachusetts. The details of that are TBD. There's an electric vehicle infrastructure coordinating council whose job it will be this fall to figure out how to spend that money. But I think we can safely assume that some of it will go to DC fast charging because that is definitely a big need in the state of Massachusetts. In Rhode Island, we are expecting the electric utility Rhode Island Energy to file a proposal this fall with the Public Utilities Commission around electric vehicles. So we are expecting Rhode Island Energy to basically say, here's some things that we want to do in the electric vehicle space in the next couple of years. And we hope that that will include some level of funding or support for DC fast charging, because again, it is very important. And then finally, a quick note before we get to questions. This is more of a teaser concept than the slide. With all of this talk about charging, it's important to note that it really matters when we charge. Electric cars will add a significant load to the grid. What we really don't want them to do is to add that load on peak demand days where particularly in the summer when it's very hot, everybody's got their air conditioning on. And demand for electricity reaches the peak for the whole year. On those days, we really don't want that peak to get any higher because those are the most polluting and the most expensive hours for the grid in the whole year. So we support a whole raft of policies that will encourage people to charge off peak, either through active demand response programs or time of use rates, which is in the interest of electric vehicle drivers because you'll be able to charge for less, but it's also in everybody's interest because it will smooth out supply and demand on the grid. So if you're interested in this, we've got a bunch of things that you can read. That's mostly a teaser idea, but since we're almost coming up on the hour, we'll move right along and say we'll take some time now to answer your questions.
So actually, Ezra, are there any questions that you think would be really great to answer live? Do you want to moderate this for us and we'll answer?
Sure. So I'm actually just answering this particular question for Isabel, which is not necessary for everyone, but I think this question would be good for Anna if she knows the answer. When will the state start adding signs that the exit has EV charging the way they do for gas service stations?
An excellent question. So this is something that I know local EV enthusiasts have been calling for a long time in Massachusetts. what is exciting is that I think it has actually caught the attention of some folks in state government. So as I mentioned a little while ago, in Massachusetts, we have an electric vehicle infrastructure coordinating council. And that is basically an interagency council that was required by last year's climate law. But what that means is that it's forcing people from the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy Resources, the Department of Environmental Management, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, that it's forcing them all to come together and think about electric vehicle charging, which was really needed because each of these agencies is kind of touching a piece of this, but there wasn't a whole lot of cross-agency communication. And in one of the last meetings before that council released an initial report, this was brought up, and someone from, I believe it was the Department of Transportation, was like, we are actively looking into this. So I'm speaking for Massachusetts. I don't think this has reached those layers of conversation in Rhode Island yet. But I am hopeful that they're thinking about it a little bit more because it was actively brought up in that setting. I will say it is a very tricky question to figure out how to do it because, as we just mentioned, there's a lot of variation in EV charging. And so you have to communicate a lot of information in one sign, which is more challenging for EVs than it is for gas stations. So I do think it warrants some thought from them, but it sounds like people are actually thinking about it.
Okay, great. We just got a question, which I think would be helpful to talk about. I know EVgo applies time of use TOU pricing. The price is significantly higher for on-peak hours, 4 to 9 p.m. I used EVgo about 2 weeks ago in Atlanta and it costs more money. Should we avoid on-peak hours?
I think from a climate and lowering costs for the grid perspective, we should always avoid on-peak hours if we can. With public charging in particular, that's a challenge because if you're going on a road trip, you're going on a road trip and you need to charge regardless of whether it's on peak or off peak. So I would say when you're charging at home, definitely avoid on-peak hours if you can. If you are a National Grid customer, there's an off-peak charging rebate you can sign up for, and hopefully something soon from Rhode Island Energy and Eversource. But sometimes it's unavoidable if you're going on a road trip.
And we have another question about the carbon footprint of EV battery manufacturing and how that compares to gas-driven vehicles.
So I will jump in here to say that it is true that the initial manufacturing process, EVs put out more of a carbon imprint. And that's just because the battery takes more manufacturing and that just takes more of a process. However, at about a year mark of driving, say around, I don't know, 15 to 21,000 miles, there's a break-even point. So that's the time when the initial manufacturing emissions plus the emissions from driving and fueling, the gas car actually starts to outstrip the electric version of it in emissions. So the overall life cycle emissions of an EV are going to be far fewer than the gas power counterparts. And we have a slide on this in Electric Vehicles 101, where I will send that along so you can check that out. And we got the information from Union of Concerned Scientists. So if you want to check that out, you definitely can.
Okay, great. We had a few questions about charging stations when they're free and who covers the cost of that. So the answer I provided is it really depends. So if it's a business, then a business is paying for that as a way to attract more customers. And if it's like a local government, then the city is paying for that. I don't know if you wanted to add more to that answer.
That is correct. It is up to the site host to decide how they're going to charge. So if it's free, that means the site host is paying for it.
So we had a question, will it cost more money to charge once the car has reached 80%? So when the rate slows down for that last 20%?
That is an it depends question, because it depends on whether the station you're using is charging you by the hour or by the kilowatt hour. So if it's by the kilowatt hour, it won't change how much you're paying. But if it's charging by time, it will. Most DC fast charging stations, though, charge by the kilowatt hour with an additional fee based on the maximum power draw. So in most cases, it shouldn't affect that.
Okay. And we just got 2 more questions. So how many years do EV batteries last, and what is the typical cost to replace the battery?
So manufacturers are very confident that the batteries are going to last the lifetime of the vehicle. That's usually like 10 to 15 years or more. And there's quite a few articles on that, though they're still being studies done as EVs are a newer technology. Manufacturers generally will have an 8-year, 100,000-mile warranty on the battery. So if you have any problems with the battery, then they'll replace it or fix it for free. You should expect like a 1% to 2% decrease in range every year or so, depending upon your driving habits, but that is still enough to last you the lifetime of the vehicle, especially if you are taking care of it in other ways. So if you're not DC fast charging all the time, you're only using it sparingly when you need to. If you're staying within the good charging range, which is like 20 to 80% generally speaking. So you want to stay within that that frame to, maximize your battery's health. So they should last the lifetime of the vehicle. I don't know how much they would cost to replace if it was out of warranty. I think that would depend upon the vehicle and what was wrong with the battery. If it was just one cell or the whole battery pack, I really don't know. But it shouldn't be an issue.
Okay, and another question, in Massachusetts, where the state requires HOAs to accommodate owners installing charging stations, what can be done to compel condo HOAs to comply if they're reluctant to install charging stations? And a second part, are there any subsidy programs to assist condo HOAs to improve charging capacity?
So on the first part of the question, the city of Boston has a right to charge ordinance that says basically a condo association can't deny someone the ability to install charging if they're willing to pay for it in their condo. Right now, that's just on a city by city basis. There is a bill before the legislature this session that would extend that idea statewide. So the bill language basically says that if you make an application to your condo board or HOA saying, I would like to install a charging station, I will pay for the charging station, it is for my use, that they have to respond within a certain amount of time and that they can't deny the application just because they feel like it, for lack of a more diplomatic way of saying it. So that is something that is before the legislature right now. Happy to send some information out about that. That would be really lovely if it passed, because we do know that condo associations and HOAs can be notoriously difficult to work with on this front. In terms of capacity and or subsidies, it gets a little bit complicated. So both National Grid, Eversource, and Unitil, for that matter, in Massachusetts have incentive programs to help bring down the costs of installing charging in multi-unit dwellings. And that includes condos. There are very quickly rules about how much support can be given if spots are deeded or not deeded. So I would recommend that you go to your electric utilities website and check that out. Massachusetts also has a program called Mass EVIP, which is Electric Vehicle Incentive Programs. And there are also incentives for multi-unit dwellings, but there's also requirements there on how many units have to be in the condo for it to qualify. So I would recommend you check out those 2 resources. In Rhode Island, I know this was a question about Massachusetts, but I know we've got Rhode Islanders on the call. In Rhode Island, there isn't an equivalent program from the electric utility or the state right now. We do hope that the filing that Rhode Island Energy will make in the fall will include support for multi-unit dwellings installing charging stations, but we have to wait and see what their filing says.
Okay, so I just want to say thank you for everybody and their questions, and I hope you learned a lot today. Before we go, Anna, I'm just going to ask you to switch to the next slide so we can show you the upcoming events we have. So tomorrow at 7, we will have Ask an EV Driver. We will host EV drivers who act as panelists to answer your questions about electric vehicles. It is very much just a conversation in a webinar. And then finally, this week, we will conclude National Drive Electric Week with an in-person event called Drive Green at the Park in Bristol, Rhode Island, where we will host also a trunk or treat. And then our final slide is if you liked the work we did, if you liked our presentation, if you like the work we do in general, we are a nonprofit, so please do consider donating. We appreciate any and everything that you could give to our cause. And we hope to see you tomorrow for the next webinar. So thank you again, everybody, and we'll be seeing you soon.